This is Luton. So guys, here I am back with my promised update. I'm going to keep this video as concise as possible because this is not a discussion video in so much as the last on the ECM was. This is simply to update people with the mechanics that we've tested and run since the patch. As I always state, I'm sure there'll be differences people find between our results and what they may experience in game, but these are the results we scored in as controlled and consistent a situation as we could create. We tested ECM versus heat-seeking and javelin missiles, flares versus heat-seekers and javelins, and the functionality and range of below radar. Everyone will have by now read the patch notes for themselves, and I gave a breakdown of the most significant changes relevant to air combat on my last video. But my non-specific summary is that they have basically shortened the lock-on for most heat-seeking missiles, improved below radar versus ground-to-air missiles, and changed the dynamic of flares to affect javelins. That's your short, bare-bones need to know. First, let's look yet again at the ECM. I'm looking at this first because despite what people commented on my previous video, the definitive guide to the ECM, nothing has changed about the dynamic of the ECM. My video still applies to how the ECM functions in that all of its main attributes, such as breaking locks, preventing locks, running for 5 seconds, having a shorter effective cooldown than flares, and removing you from air radar, all of these still function as before. The way in which the ECM affects launched heat-seeking missiles has also remained the same for jets and helis. Notably, they affect missiles strongly when in the heli and barely at all when flying in jets. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the functionality of below radar. Now some people still don't understand that below radar is not something you equip. Once you unlock it, it's always active as a passive device, meaning that it doesn't require you to select it, it's just always on. Below radar functions when you are low to the ground for around 2 to 3 seconds. It will break a tracking lock and prevent you from being locked onto. And when flying in a jet, this is quite difficult to actually use. If you want to escape someone locking you, you could try to hit the deck, or if you're coming in for a run and want to avoid stingers, then again, flying low could be a good choice. But it's not really ideal for jets, and there's plenty of other manoeuvres you can use that don't require dangerous flying low on the ground. In a helicopter though, below radar does come into its own, and especially now that it affects infantry-based missiles like the Stinger and the Igloo. To understand how below radar functions, I've made this simple diagram. If you didn't already know this, then listen up. Below radar operates by your literal distance from the ground, so it doesn't measure altitude as such, because this would be your distance from sea level. It functions by measuring your height from the ground. So in theory, if you were flying at a medium height and started to get locked on, instead of flying down to the ground, which could be dangerous and also you may run out of time, if you were to say strafe to your side and move towards an area of ground or mountain that reduced the distance from your heli to the ground, this would activate below radar and hopefully prevent you from a missile lock. So for a helicopter, this can be absolutely devastating for ground-to-air missile teams trying to lock you up. One of the other changes that's been made is the distance for locking for ground-to-air missiles like the Stinger and the Igloo. We wanted to find out just how severe a change this has been, so in this footage here you can see us trying to lock on the distance and also the main altitude. So in terms of distance, you can see here it's actually still quite a long way, and you can get a lock at quite a reasonable range. And in terms of height, again, it takes quite a high altitude to actually completely lose a lock. So the Stinger hasn't, they haven't been changed so severely that they're completely incapable. It's the below radar more often than not which is causing the main problem. And there we go, you see, losing the lock only there at quite a high altitude indeed. So we cross over now to the footage in helicopter. And again, we wanted to measure the actual, the height, the AGL, at where you lose a lock. And it's quite difficult to tell. We got some varying results. We tested it several times, and it would change, it would vary kind of each time. An interesting thing that we found was that you had to actually go higher to lose a lock than you did to be acquired on one. So we often found we had to go up to about 270, 275 to lose the lock itself. But then after that, we couldn't get our guy on the ground to lock us up until we came back down to about 260, which, that's kind of curious. I can't really sort of make sense of that one, but that's what we kind of found. You see, it only starts getting a lock up now when I'm coming back to about 260. So that's the changes that have been made. Again, not too severe, but it does obviously have an effect on the gameplay. Okay, and lastly I'm looking at the changes made to the flares. Now many people thought that giving flares the ability to distract javelin missiles as well as heat seekers would make the flares very, very powerful and mean that helicopters, when combined with things like below radar, would become almost impossible to destroy. I'm very happy to report that the effectiveness of flares against javelin missiles has been greatly overestimated. I would go as far to say that in a real game situation it's about as effective as a jet trying to avoid launch heat seekers with the ECM, so in short, very unreliable. Me and my guys tested it in live games as well as in controlled situations, and so far I've only found one situation where the flares reliably distract javelins, and to do so means that you basically have to sit hovering at an average height and average distance, and you also have to time your flare deployment perfectly. Any other change to your distance, timing or height, or God forbid you should actually be in motion, and the reliability of flares against locked javelins seems to fall to anything as low as 10 to 15% effective. If you have more than one javelin launched at you, bail out, because you'll be going down unless you can pull off some extreme evasive maneuvers. The functionality of the flares was pretty clear, so our overall result was that from 30 tests, the effectiveness of flares versus javelins was 30% miss and 70% hit to kill. But bear in mind that the only time we managed to get the javelin to actually miss was as demonstrated, average distance, average height, and once you go low or high or moving, we registered a kill on every javelin fired, so it's really not very practical to use in a live game, and I definitely wouldn't feel safe relying on it. Another interesting thing that we found out is that I think many people might have found for themselves is that weirdly, despite the patch notes saying that flares would, and I quote, "Flares will no longer break the lock of a vehicle that is locked on, it will only distract the missiles." That's kind of interesting because as we demonstrate here, it seems to break a lock nearly every single time it's used. So flares will break the lock of a SOFLAM or CITV, or basically any laser designation system nearly every single time. But it's pretty ineffective at distracting launched javelin missiles, guided shells, etc, etc. It can distract them, and we have seen in our testing multiple times when it did actually affect them, or they missed completely. But as I always say in my videos, you have to think of literal, practical, in-game situations, not these technicalities. Testing it in a controlled environment is a simple way for us to check the behaviour of a piece of kit without having to consider a range of variables and what could be affecting it. Once you know how something works, it's much easier to evaluate how effective it actually is in a game. And from these tests and seeing it in game, our conclusion was that flares are pretty much the same as they were before, except that now weirdly they seem to be able to break laser locks, which makes even less sense than anything I've tested so far, and I don't even know where to begin with trying to rationalise it. So, in summary, the ECM functions as it did before the patch. Flares now have the illogical ability to break laser designated locks, but their ability to distract javelins is negligible. Below radar is extremely effective and can render heat-seeking attacks against helicopters almost null and void. There are many other aircraft dynamics to consider that have changed with the patch, such as the power and timings of some weapons, the improved power of ground-to-air missiles, and much more. But as they say, that's another story.